Thank you, Jan-Erik. We'll see, José will start my presentation. I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me here to give this presentation here at this sort of first event of the IGSHPA Sweden chapter. I'm extremely happy to be here. I started studying mechanical engineering here once, 1992. And then I continued after my thesis. I started as a graduate student at the department who's hosting this event as well. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy about the setup with the Swedish chapter of IGSHPA. I think it makes perfect sense. It is in the same kind of setup as I've seen and learned the way it is set up in the US. So I wish you a very successful future, and I hope that we can collaborate, all stakeholders in the industry. We need a united industry all over, even though we have come quite far in the heat pump industry here in Sweden. And I will today give you a little bit of an overview of not only the Swedish market. I will not talk very much about the Swedish market because I reckon that the great majority of the audience here knows the Swedish market pretty well. So I'll try to give you a little bit more of an insight, slight scratching the surface of some other markets here in Europe, and touch upon some similarities and differences with different markets. The reason why we have a very good argument for our technology, I could say it's pretty well summarized by this picture and the agreement that was reached in Paris in December at the COP21 meeting. I was very fortunate to be invited to give a very short and brief presentation at this event, but you should all know that I didn't speak to Mr. Obama or neither of these guys, but it's such a huge event with hundreds of different sessions, so I was just a minor player here, tiny player. But I was there. It was an historic meeting, and the deal that was made could be summarized in this picture. This is pretty much the Paris Agreement in a nutshell. If we don't do anything, if we keep on business as usual, we will follow the grayish scenario here with ever increasing greenhouse gas emissions. But if we are to achieve the goals that was really came to a conclusion at the Paris Agreement, that we should reduce the environmental impact and global warming and limit it to well below 2 degrees, which was then more exactly defined as 1.5 degrees. We have to follow the blue scenario here. And as you see, this means quite dramatic drop in the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where we come in, because we need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in all sectors. Electricity generation, transport, but what we believe has been so far very much overlooked is the heating sector. And we need to address this. CO2 emissions from fossil fuels has to be pretty much phased out before 2050. We need to act now. And this also applies to the European, and I would say even the American and many other areas around the world. We need to address the heating sector as well. And I believe that this has been very much overlooked for far too long. Every new installed gas boiler is a missed opportunity, because that gas boiler will pretty likely be in use for 20 to 25 years. We need to make the shift now. So this means that we have to have a quick uptake of new technologies, not only heat pumps, not only ground source heat pumps. And this is not at all happening. So if we look at the global market for domestic boilers, this is the big picture. This is actually what is happening. It is not a shift from fossil fuels to other carbon lean technologies. It's a shift from non-condensing boilers to condensing boilers, heavily lobbied by the oil and gas mafia, as we sometimes call them. And of course they claim that this is the good way to go. This is improvement. This is CO2 emissions reduction. Yes, it is, but it's not enough. This will not take us where we have to go. So based on the existing policies that are in place in Europe today, looking at technology development and political decisions that have been made, this is what the Commission, how they projects the future. You have the use of, well, it's kilotons of oil equivalents on the y-axis, and the development over time. So this is what we expect here, that this is with the existing policies. And as you see, there is no dramatic drop at all. This will not take us anywhere. And this is the reasoning for my work. What I do, I'm pretty much a lobbyist. What I do almost on a daily basis is that I have contacts with authorities, ministries in many countries, mainly in Sweden, but also in contact with other ministries in Europe, and quite often have meetings with the Commission trying to push them in what we believe is the right direction. And we stand for heat pump technologies. I am employed by a heat pump manufacturer, not only a ground source heat pump manufacturer. We develop and sell, market air-to-water heat pumps, exhaust air heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, and domestic hot water heat pumps, and many other different types. So we have pretty much the full spectrum. And in my position as the president of the IGSHPA, I really tried to lobby and push for the whole heat pump market in Europe to go forward. And looking at the sales of the heat pumps on the European market, you can see that it has not really dramatically increased. 2015 was an all-time high for Europe. We sold in the member states of the European Union around almost 900,000 heat pumps. This does not include the great majority of small single-split air-to-air heat pumps that are pretty much defined as air conditioning, mainly used for cooling. There is one exception from this. We do count the air-to-air of single-split units for the markets where these products are really marketed for heating purposes, and that is in Finland. It used to be in Sweden as well. However, we don't have the correct statistics anymore, so we don't really publish that. And the same goes for Norway, where we include that. So it's not even 900,000 units being sold last year in Europe, and that was all-time high. And just to give you a sort of a picture on how much or how little is this, I can tell you that only in the UK last year there was 1.6 million gas boilers sold, only in one country. Now, this was the overall heat pump market. Now, today we are to focus a little bit more on the ground source heat pump market. And that has a not too promising development here in Europe. Now I will show you just how this develops from 2007. This is the picture of the heat pump market and the share of the different types of heat pumps here. So the dark bluish field here, that's air-to-water units, and the brown part here that you should focus on, that's the ground source heat pumps. And this is for the European market, all the member states of Europe. So this is how it has developed over the years. And what we have seen then lately is that a very much growing market share for air-to-water heat pumps and sanitary hot water heat pumps that have really boomed the last couple of years. And ground source heat pumps have been losing its market share quite substantially. Quite substantially. And on many markets, this is a negligible market. Sweden is an exception. Now, to give you some very brief, there are many reasons behind this, but trying to give you some reasons behind it, which I believe is quite common and in common for all these markets where we're seeing dropping market share for ground source heat pumps. This is due to the higher costs, mainly for the drilling. But, you know, cost for drilling varies dramatically all over Europe. In Sweden, it's cheap. I don't know any other market or country in Europe where it's cheaper to drill than in Sweden. In other countries, it can be 2-3 times more expensive than here in Sweden. What we also see happening quite a lot is that on the continent, regulation regarding drilling is quite cumbersome to overcome. You have to fulfill quite a few requirements, and it's a big fuss in many countries, and can in some cases also be quite costly to get the permission to drill. So less fuss with the authorities if you go for an air-to-water heat pumps. And then we have seen quite a dramatic improvement in the efficiency of the air-to-water heat pump. So it's actually then as well getting more difficult to argue for the higher efficiency that we get with the ground source heat pump. In the long term, we can see a change in this, but not right now. Then we also see some contractors that believe that if I'm to do a ground source heat pump project, typically I will need to have a subcontractor, the driller. So it's more convenient to have everything in-house, do it all yourself, and that can be provided with a heat pump installation instead. So these are some of the reasons behind it. It's not all true for all markets, but I think that these are some common denominators for most of the markets in Europe. But everything is not disastrous. If we have a bigger view on looking at the ground source heat pump market penetration in the different countries here in Europe, I just received this slide from the good friend of mine, Burkhard Sanner, who has compiled these statistics. On the left y-axis here, you see the ground source heat pumps that are in operation today, or estimated to be in operation today in the different countries. And that corresponds also to the darker bars here in the chart. The lighter ones are the sales in 2015. And then you should look at the right y-axis there, which is the number of units of ground source heat pump units sold last year. So as you see here, Sweden is by far the most dominating country in Europe. And still we have the largest market for ground source heat pumps annually. And taking into account that we are a fairly, in terms of population anyways, a small country with roughly 9 million inhabitants, it's quite amazing that we have such a high market share here in Sweden. The second most important market is Germany, and then we have, in terms of number of installations or in operations right now, as number 3 we have France. But as you can also see, for France the sales are extremely low at the moment in France, and has been for quite some years. And this is a problem for the industry in France. Other more promising markets, I would like to highlight Finland. Finland, our neighboring countries. The Finnish people, in my opinion, I might be wrong, but I have the impression that the Finnish people look quite often at Sweden and what Sweden does. They do 5-10 years after we did it. So they are lagging behind, but there is a great market opportunity there, because the possibilities for ground source heat pumps in Finland is quite like the possibilities in Sweden. So I will get back to that a little bit more later on. Another interesting market in Europe is Poland. Poland is catching up fairly well, I'd say, but still from very low numbers. But taking into the potential with this fairly big country, I think for the future this is a really promising country. And then just to give you, especially for our international friends here, to give you an impression of how far we have actually come here in Sweden, I show you a picture from the, I don't know what it's called in English, this Energy Well archive. This is a picture, a map from the area where I live. The grayish squares here are buildings. The greenish rectangulars here are energy wells for ground source heat pumps. You see there is a figure around these grayish rectangular here. That's the borehole depth. And the blue ones are water wells. So the penetration for ground source heat pumps in the area where I live is more than 70%. And this was an area where the buildings were built around 1905 to 1920, somewhere in that range. So all these installations are retrofit installations. And to the right hand side of this picture, you see that there are no ground source heat pumps at all. And this area here is for multi-family buildings, and it's covered by district heating. However, the district heating company in this area are using large heat pumps in their system. Not ground source heat pumps, there are sewage water heat pumps. And in addition to that, they use biomass boilers as well. So that was the broader picture and some picture of how it looks in Sweden. If we look again to the European market, I don't have time to go through each and every one of them, but I will give you some hints, some information about some specific markets here that I think is quite interesting. What we see is that ground source heat pumps have a strong place in the market in Sweden, in Finland. It's not doing too bad, but it's losing market share also in Switzerland, Germany, and a really sort of a crisis almost in France. So I'm trying to show you these different countries here and then some hints about the characteristics that might, if we can find a reasoning behind here, why we are successful on some markets and not on some other markets. So getting back again then to have a look at the Swedish heat pump market development. This is from 1994 up to last year. In this chart we only include the ground source heat pumps. Those are the green bars here, and in addition to that we put in the exhaust air heat pumps and air to water heat pumps. And then the line you see here, that's the market share for ground source heat pumps and how it has developed over the years. And you see the market share now, it's above 50% here in Sweden. And some of the reasons behind this is that I think it goes back actually down to 1995. There was a lot of discussions on governmental level then that we need to do something to shift from oil towards more renewable options, more clean options, even though we didn't talk so much about renewable energy at that time. But we needed to reduce the dependence on oil. So then they initiated a technology procurement program. It was a sort of a heat pump competition. And there were 2 appointed winners in this heat pump competition. And from then on, when these 2 winners were appointed, the heat pump industry, actually the ground source heat pump industry, got a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and a lot of people started to work with it. So this is often referred to as the great success and breakthrough for ground source heat pump in Sweden. And this is really quite strange, because these 2 appointed winners were 2 catastrophic products. This was not to blame the manufacturers all too much, because during this competition they changed the rules. This was a time when we were starting to say that we need to phase out the use of freons. We were not allowed to use R22 anymore. So at that time there were no real compressors for these types of applications developed for the use of any of the new HFCs at the time. So what they had to do was to do a drop-in retrofit for an R22 compressor. And at that time they didn't know what oil to use, and it was a great catastrophe. But even though it was a catastrophe, this is often seen as the major breakthrough for ground source heat pumps in Sweden. And now people, almost everyone knows what a ground source heat pump is. I couldn't say any other country probably in the world where the knowledge, or at least knowledge, they've heard the term, they know it provides heating. They don't necessarily know how it really works, but they don't care. They don't ask so much if they're going to buy a heat pump. There is some fuss if they're actually going to buy a ground source heat pump or not, but the neighbor did it, so we also buy it. It's not a big thing here at all. That is very well true for the retrofit market. For the new construction market, the story is quite different. We have a tiny, tiny, tiny market share for new construction of single-family houses for ground source heat pumps. The energy demand, heating demand for these houses are much lower, and a ground source heat pump application is in many cases seen as too expensive. However, the market share for new builds and ground source heat pumps is increasing at the moment in Sweden. In Germany, we have this situation. Here you see in the light-colored bars here, that's the air-to-water heat pumps. And the orange type, those are the ground source heat pumps. And the line here is showing the market share for the ground source heat pumps. This slide again here was shared with me by Burkhard Sanner, and I owe him a lot for this information. And as you see, this is also a quite dramatic drop in Germany for the market share of ground source heat pumps. Right now, we are seeing a recovery for ground source heat pumps in Germany, however. And this is, I'd say, pretty much only caused by an existing subsidy scheme that is in place, that wasn't put in place last year in April to give some extra promotion for ground source heat pumps. You can, as a private household owner, you can get as much as 4,000 euros, which is a tremendous high amount of money to subsidize your ground source heat pump installation. Otherwise, what is cutting us back is that the market in Germany is very differentiated depending on which area in Germany you are. Some areas are quite liberal, where you can get your permit to drill fairly easy. The geology in some areas is bearable, whereas in some cases is very difficult to drill. So the cost for drilling in Germany is it varies dramatically. The average price for drilling in Germany is the lower end would be 35 to 40 euros, and it goes up even to 100 euros per meter. But if it costs 100 euro per meter, it's pretty much a no-no. That's it's really difficult to justify such high cost. What could be also worthwhile mentioning is that in new builds, heat pumps, taking into account all the different types of heat pumps, have a market share in new builds of 34%, which is quite good. Then if we have a look at the market in Switzerland, Switzerland being a fairly small country in Central Europe, it is, I guess for most people, you have in mind the impression that this is an expensive country. And it is also when it comes to heat pumps. But still, the market is fairly stable. But even in Switzerland, we've seen a shift towards a higher and higher market share for air-to-water heat pumps and a diminishing market share for ground source heat pumps. Some cantons in Switzerland are offering subsidies for heat pumps, but they also, in most cases, also offer the subsidy for air-to-water heat pumps. So people tend to go for air-to-water heat pumps in many occasions. However, there are some areas where ground source heat pumps are much preferred located in the colder parts of the Alps. And then we have the good and promising country, our neighboring country, Finland. Here you see the sales development of heat pumps in Finland. The bluish, light bluish bars here represent the sales of the single split air-to-air units. And the reason why we include them here is that in Finland they are pretty much purely marketed as heating devices. The cooling functionality of these products come as a sort of added value to the product. And not all consumers are even aware of that it can provide cooling. And the reason why these are sold in such high numbers in Finland, in Sweden, and in Norway is that in these countries we've had for a very long time and still have a fairly high market share for direct electricity heating. And then for these houses, this is the most cost-effective way to reduce your energy bill. If you install a single split air-to-air unit, the payback is less than 3 years, even 2 years in some cases. However, when it comes to new construction, it is quite amazing that in Finland, ground source heat pumps, our just neighboring country, in Sweden I mentioned that ground source heat pumps have a very tiny market share for new builds, whereas in Finland it's the #1 country in Europe, and I'd say pretty much probably in the world. It has a market share of 53% for new builds in Finland. And if you look at the type of heat pumps that are sold and installed in hydronic heating systems, ground source heat pumps have a market share of 75%. So this is a good and promising market. And in Finland, the potential will still be there for another, my estimation is 10 years. The Finnish people are now phasing out oil. The pace is at the moment fairly slow due to the low price of oil. But there are still about 200,000 oil boilers left in Finland, and that's the main market potential there. A few words on France then, which is the really troublesome country here. We have seen over the years, year after year, a quite substantial drop in the market. And here, the industry needs to do something, or otherwise we were pretty much almost completely gone. So I'm trying to summarize some of these market characteristics in this picture here, where you on the top, sort of I don't hardly see the colors on that screen, but the top square there is trying to picture the picture in new builds of single-family houses, and below the x-axis we have the retrofit market, and we have the price for a turnkey solution installation, typical, so to say, for a single-family house of a ground source heat pump, expressed in thousands of euros. So as you see, and then on the y-axis you have the market share in the different building categories. So if we look at Sweden at first, we see that Sweden, the price of such an installation is, to our estimates, probably the cheapest one in Europe, mainly due to the fact that we have the cheapest drilling cost. We have a tiny market share in new builds, but the strongest market share when it comes to retrofit installations. Then we have France, where there is hardly any installations being made in new builds. It's all going to the retrofit market, and for slightly larger buildings there where you can justify the investment. It is one step more expensive than in Sweden due to higher drilling cost. Then we have Finland, which is even slightly more expensive, at least according to the Finnish Heat Pump Association. I was a little bit surprised to see that the price difference was so great as compared to Sweden. And as you see there, we have a very high market share for ground source heat pumps in new builds, but as well in the retrofit sector. Finland is a very promising market. I need to finish now, wrap up very quickly. In Germany, you see the prices are higher. We have a fairly good market share in the new builds, and this is, I'd say, there is a risk that this is just temporary and induced due to the fact that we have these quite profitable subsidies in place. And then we have the high premium market, which is in Switzerland, where the cost for these installations are tremendously high, but everything else is also tremendously high in Switzerland, so they seem to accept these prices anyway. The market there is fairly stable. Just finishing up here, if we are to pick some common success factors for ground source heat pumps, well, at least here in Europe, I know it's a different story in the US where you don't have that much hydronic heating, but we don't have that much air-based heating, ducted air systems for our heat distribution. We have hydronic heating systems to a great extent. And in the areas where you introduce underfloor heating, which is a tremendous trend, and a great majority of all new builds in Sweden, Finland, Norway, they have all pretty much underfloor heating, which raises the opportunities to reach a high efficiency for these installations. Larger heating loads, then of course it makes sense for a higher investment. If you have liberal drilling regulations, that's also beneficial for us. And with that, I think I really have to stop my presentation so that I don't entirely destroy the agenda for today. Just finish off with this picture, which I realized looked pretty much like the picture Björn Palm showed. This is the future that we would like to see, the smart cities for the future. And we see that heat pumps will play a very important role as integrator of all these renewable energy technologies in the future. I am convinced, I'm not skeptical, I'm convinced that heat pumps and ground source heat pumps in the future have a great future ahead of us. Thank you.